Claudia Ribeiro, and I'm a project officer at Polis, the European network of cities and regions working on transport innovation. I would like to welcome you to Unit 4 of the first SOLUTIONSplus E-course, focusing on what does e-mobility look like on the ground. This module will introduce the main existing policy measures, instruments, and incentives regulating local air, noise, and space pollution. Local air and noise pollution have been linked to a high number of premature deaths worldwide. The most vulnerable citizen groups seem to be most affected by pollution, as lower income neighborhoods reach levels of NO2 concentrations up to 50% higher than in wealthy areas, although car ownership is lower in these areas. Cities are under pressure to tackle this challenge. These issues are directly connected with urban space management. Access regulations allow regulators to modulate the transport demand and spread it outside peak hours. This module focuses on these and other examples of measures, tools, and instruments that cities are using to address these challenges locally, for which e-mobility plays an important role. Urban vehicle access regulations, or UVARs, are increasingly popular measures to reduce the burden of air and noise pollution on citizens. These have been implemented across the world under different schemes to positively impact the reduction of emissions, traffic congestion, or simply to give pedestrians and cyclists more space. The most common types include low emission zones, zero emission zones, parking regulations, congestion charging schemes, limited traffic, and pedestrian zones. In fact, developing low emission and zero emission zones can also provide a clear signal to vehicle makers to accelerate the mass production of zero emission vehicles. UVARs are important measures, but need to be part of a wider framework for the decarbonization of transport to reach their potential. We have highlighted other relevant instruments in the different units of this e-course. The R in Uvar stands for regulation and not for restriction. UVARs do not restrict access to vehicles altogether, but instead regulate the conditions under which vehicles can access a certain area. Such conditions can concern vehicle weight or size, time periods, time of day, day of the week, emission levels, either per vehicle or within a certain area, resident status, payment of a certain fee, and occupancy level. There are several important dimensions to consider when deploying UVARs. Firstly, communication on measures, both to local but also to non-residents and daily commuters, is essential. Secondly, dialogue between all relevant stakeholders is essential to ensure that UVARs successfully achieve their goals. Then, a common approach could also be helpful to local authorities, national access points for data users, and developers of applications for navigation software and route planners to cooperate to share information about tools. Then, introduction of UVARs should also consider other dimensions, such as stakeholder empowerment, acceptance and buy-in, or just as an integrated package of measures, for instance, UVARs and freight, UVARs and occasional visitors, and how these might evolve over time. The integration and interconnection of local and national policies is important for UVARs as it is for other policies to be successful. For additional information on this, we invite you to revisit the contents of Unit 3 of the same e-course. Low emission zones are areas where vehicular access is limited to vehicles that meet certain emission characteristics. Normally, these imply access restrictions to the most polluting vehicles. For example, in Europe, they consider European standard emission categories. As of 2019, over 250 European cities had low emission zones, and these seem to be supported by most European citizens. A survey carried out by Transport and Environment for Europe shows that 67% of interviewees either strongly or somewhat support the introduction of low emission zones. On the other hand, zero emission zones are more radical versions of these, and they have begun to spread to help cities meet their climate neutrality targets, in line with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Zero emission zones are areas in cities in which only vehicles emitting zero emissions when in use are allowed. This definition may include pedestrians, bikers, electric vehicles, and others. There are also exemptions both for low emission and zero emission zones, for example, allowing access to emergency vehicles. These vehicles need to be easily identifiable as being compliant with the access rules, with a sticker, or being part of the database created for the effect. Check out part 2 of this first lecture for more information on the importance of UVARs, low emission and zero emission zones, and specific examples of best practices.
Several projects and research initiatives have analyzed urban vehicle access regulations and assessed their importance, but also ways to make them into an even more effective policy measure for sustainability. The EU-funded project, REVEAL, is one of the several ones carrying out this work. It aims to provide tailored Uvar support and guidance for cities and regions that want to implement these types of measures. It also provides tools to support a systematic and coordinated way to develop best practices by helping cities in selecting the Uvar strategy which is most suitable for them, and providing guidance on how the Uvar can be successfully implemented. There are different measures within the project related to zero emission zones, super blocks, but also intelligent speed assistance, limited traffic zones, among many others. The project already has quite some results available. Firstly, it investigated a different range of Uvar measures, both well-established and cutting-edge ones, and grouped them under 4 measure fields. These 4 measure fields are broken down into so-called Uvar building blocks. This means that an Uvar strategy can be formed by several different building blocks. REVEAL has also developed 8 detailed case studies on cities that have successfully implemented Uvar measures. You will find all the relevant project publications in our resource list slide at the end of the lecture. REVEAL understands Uvar measures as a process which has different phases, starting from its ideation to its design, implementation, and operation. It considers governance and financing, user needs and acceptance, mobility concepts, and system design and technology as essential to address. REVEAL is producing a series of guidance documents to help cities on specific aspects related to UVARs. Some of these notes of guidance are already available. For instance, the geofencing guidance document for Uvar access regulations. REVEAL also developed an evaluation framework to monitor the work process, providing both quantitative and qualitative data as a basis for comprehensive evaluation. The framework also allows to detect patterns and to draw empirically founded conclusions, to identify transferable lessons about good practices and issues to avoid, with recommendations for practitioners and policymakers. A 2019 report from Transport and Environment claims that a substantial body of scientific research provides strong health and social equity arguments associated with low emission zones. The report says that, according to the World Health Organization, toxic air is estimated to decrease life expectancy of every European by an average of almost 1 year. It also highlights the main conditions behind the success of the existing low emission zones across Europe. Design is essential for its effectiveness. Conditions such as territory covered, measures for enforcement, exemptions granted, and the clarity of the policies are essential. Further, exemptions and financial support schemes should be used to assist lower income households and business for which using these vehicles is essential and that cannot afford cleaner alternatives. Next, a phase out of internal combusted engines is crucial, a move that some cities have already started to make. But then, what is next for low emission zones? The report advocates that these should gradually be converted into zero emission zones. However, it is important to understand that both measures cannot be implemented in a void, but rather need to complement other policies that promote the transition to cleaner alternatives, including walking and cycling and electrification of all modes of transportation. Before digging deeper into the topics of how zero emission zones are being implemented, let us look at a few examples of how cities plan or have already implemented successful low emission and zero emission zones. First, Oxford in the United Kingdom wants transport in the city to be emission-free by 2035. One of their plans is the creation of the Oxford Zero Emission Zone, with a pilot in the city centre to start in August 2021. The pilot will be based on a road users charging scheme, which means that vehicles operating in the zone will be subject to charges depending on their emissions. 100% zero-emission vehicles will be able to be used in the zone free of charge, while other vehicles will be charged from £2 to £10 a day to drive in the zone between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. This fee charged will increase as of 2025. There will also be discounts and exemptions for some road users, including disabled motorists, residents, and businesses established in the zone. Earlier in the SOLUTIONSplus E-course, you heard Minister Elke van den Brand talk about Brussels' ambitious plans for climate neutrality. The Brussels region also plans to implement a kilometer tax in 2022 named Smart Move. This rate will be calculated by time of travel, considering peak and non-peak hours, number of kilometers traveled, and cubic capacity of vehicle. The city's low emission zone is also an example of successful implementation. Let us also hear what the minister had to say about it.
It's also within the measurements you take about, for example, for air pollution, we have a lot of measurements that we've started to do to map the problem and to show the problem, because air pollution is often not detected. We have a low emission zone, so bit by bit we are excluding the most polluting cars from our city. It is in every aspect.
Moving to zero emission zones, in 2020, Transport Decarbonization Alliance, C40 and Polis prepared a first-of-a-kind guide inviting relevant stakeholders to consider the advantages of creating zero-emission zones for freight in and around cities. The report draws several important conclusions. Firstly, few cities and countries have devised a vision for zero-emission freight operations, even if urban freight produces an outsized share of air pollution and CO2 emissions. Secondly, well-designed zero-emission zones for freight encourage more efficient logistics by reducing the number of trips, a better mix of transport modes by using shared cargo bikes or light electric vehicles for last-mile deliveries, and a transition of the remaining vans and trucks to zero-emission. Additionally, devising a zero-emission zones for freight is a complex process involving many stakeholders. Owners and operators of freight vehicles range from multinational companies to sole proprietors shops, and from trade people to professionals providing repair and maintenance services. The report also mentions that to enable cooperation and to create effective rules and incentives to regulate zero-emission zones for freight, it is essential to understand the interests, needs and concerns of the different stakeholders involved. Preference should also be given to zero-emission freight vehicles for zone accessibility, time windows and through subsidies and other incentives. This can help jumpstart the market for zero-emission freight vehicles and accelerate the overall transition to zero-carbon transport. And lastly, policies might need to be aligned across different levels of government and neighboring districts or even countries. Cities often lack the jurisdiction to regulate the zero-emission zone, and many companies operate across multiple cities and neighboring countries. So, common approach allows them to plan and invest with greater confidence. The guide also provides examples of successful experiences in developing zero-emission zones for freight. The Netherlands aims to have 30 to 40 cities with implemented and harmonized zero-emission zones for freight by 2025. This ambition comes in the footsteps of the Dutch National Climate Agreement, which requires the logistics sector to reduce significantly CO2 emissions. The cities involved will announce details for these zones 4 years before deployment, to allow for sufficient time for implementation. The country also has developed nationwide harmonized principles for zero-emission freight. These specify that all new delivery vans and trucks, both after 2025, must be zero-emission if they are to enter any city with a zero-emission zone. It also sets phasing out existing fossil fuel commercial vehicles, with a transition phase ending in 2027 for existing vans and in 2029 for trucks. The government will also offer tax incentives and subsidies between 2021 and 2025 to help companies transition to zero-emission vans and trucks. Lastly, cities can receive support from an expert pool to help identify key challenges for their context, create implementation plans, share learnings on a national level, and provide tools and support for the local decision-making process. If you want to read more about what was mentioned in this video or in part 1 of this lecture, make sure to check out the list of additional reading materials that we have prepared for you. Thank you, and until next time.